Good afternoon. I'm Kim Crenshaw, a member of the faculty here, and importantly, a member of the CRS faculty. I'd like to greet our distinguished panelists, our colleagues, our students, friends of CRS, and family of CRS. I'm particularly pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's panel, Misrepresentation and Misogyny, Intersections of Gender, Culture, and Media. So our panel takes up the question of Imus and Beyond, which is in the conference title, specifically addressing how media framings obscure the intersectional nature of discrimination and how stereotypical presentations of people of color and their sexuality in media influence interracial interactions and opportunities in workplaces, universities, and in public spaces. Now, because our stepping off point is the Imus affair, let me spend a few minutes revisiting that particularly rich moment to distill some of the vexing questions that will be the focal point of our inquiry today. On April 6, 2007, the Rutgers women's basketball team's Cinderella ride through the Final Four was ended by a heartbreaking loss to Tennessee. The next morning, shock jock Don Imus, in chatter with his co-host, remarked on how scary-looking the Rutgers college women were. Now, against video footage of the team's desperate efforts to keep their dreams alive, Imus searched for a fitting label upon which to capture these African-American women. Taking the lead from the co-host, Imus amended what he suggested to finally proclaim them to be nappy-headed hoes, who in contrast to the Tennessee V's were the jigaboos to the Lady V's wannabes, the unattractive, undesirable, ill-groomed, and let's face it, the black women to the appealing specter of the Lady V's. Controversy built slowly to the final dismissal of Imus, but not before protests, boycotts, revenue loss, civil rights leaders, rap artists, feminist organizations, and the general public weighed in. Somewhere in the den were the members of the women's basketball teams themselves, who simply wanted to know why. Why, they asked, would their accomplishments, their efforts to carry themselves with dignity, be targeted and diminished by this shock jock? As the debate wore on and Imus performed what some call a ritual apology, efforts to define, vet, and intervene in the spectacle took various forms. So, rapper Snoop Dogg had these fine words to say. We're not talking about no collegiate basketball girls who have made it to the next level of education in sports, more or less defending the argument that he uses the term hoes all the time. We ain't talking about hoes that's in the, we talking about hoes that's in the hood that ain't doing shit. Is trying to get a nigga for his money. We ain't no old ass white men that sit up on MSNBC going hard on black girls. Snoop Dogg. Now, for him, the problem was that Imus, in admittedly reproducing categories that Imus himself said had been widely available within black hip-hop culture, was simply reproducing a general derogatory term universally used for black women. While loftier debates ensued about whether the issue boiled down to who could call black women nappy-headed hoes, Snoop Dogg set the record straight. The problem with traveling signifiers, he tells us, is that they sometimes just get the objects of this contemptuous term wrong. Nappy-headed is not an all-purpose term for all black women, especially not those women. Hoes are women who deployed their sexuality for personal gain. Obviously, these women weren't doing that. But on some level, it's unclear whether it was because they were doing something else, namely playing basketball, or because they were indeed nappy-headed, which somewhat ran counter to the credentials to be hoes. Add to that the possibility that they might also be lesbians. Now, if this nuance was lost on Snoop Dogg's behalf, it was made clear in D.L. Hughley's riff on The Tonight Show, where he demurs on the question of whether or not they were hoes, but affirms that surely they were nappy-headed, and also among the ugliest black women he'd ever seen. Now, against this onslaught swirling around, there were a few efforts to open up counter-performances. A YouTube video of Essence Carson's, the junior basketball star, juxtaposing her intensity on the field with her intensity playing the piano, classical music, presented a reverse shock that played upon perhaps even their staunchest defenders' own stereotypes of who Essence Carson essentially was. So what are the ways that this episode casts light on the issues that we are going to discuss today? First, there is the question of the media as a site of intersectional harm, a harm frequently dismissed as just jokes, just marketing, just aesthetics. All these justs are deployed to mark these injuries as injuries of choice, of subjectivity, as opposed to injuries of fact and materiality. Second, there's the particular form of intersectional discrimination that media uniquely represent. Hierarchies of beauty, sexuality, and desire that constitute rankings of performance and appearance that are then policed and graded to subordinate some non-conforming bodies over others. Third, there is the type of intersectionality revealed here. Injuries that are targeted, sometimes indisputably, about a particular group. In this case, it was no doubt that this was a targeted injury against a particular kind of woman who's black and a particular kind of black who is a woman. It is also about compound discrimination. The media are simultaneously racist, sexist, heterosexist, not only in its representations, but in its decision makers as well, thus ensuring that few people are in decision-making roles who would have much of a sensibility about the injuries that are produced. And finally, there are the strategies of resistance, efforts to make the injuries legitimate, make the injuries legible, either by counter-performance, as we saw with Essence Carson, or by heightening the cost of producing the injury, as in the firing of Imus. This, of course, raises questions about how to measure these cost-raising strategies and how to think about who it is that will be paying them. So each of our panelists today will offer a further meditation on these questions, seeking to interrogate the relationships between the arena of representation and the perpetuation of intersectional forms of discrimination. So, beginning on the first level, the media as a site of intersectional injury, Horacio Roque Ramirez will draw on his research on LGBT and queer Spanish language television to explore media and representations of gender and sexuality, and how the vectors of analysis inform racial, ethnic, and nation-based elements of exclusion. Grounded also in the plane of representation and imagery are questions of how the apparatuses of law and culture facilitate the circulation of injurious injuries and at the same time function to limit the use of law to assist in certain strategies to rename and redeploy such representations. So Professor Sonia Cachal will take up this question, interrogating the provocative contradiction apparent in the trademark protection granted to the Washington Redskins against claims of Native Americans and the refusal to permit the trademarking of dykes on bikes. Moving to the nature and dynamics of intersectional discrimination, Professor Marianne Case ponders the question of gendered performance as a mechanism of ethnic and religious subordination. But what may at first appear to be a mode of coercion deployed against external others may in fact reflect performances located and practiced, at least initially, on internal objects. Then moving to strategies of resistance, Professor Mignon Moore, our colleague at UCLA, in the tradition of juxtaposing richly textured contours of life against representations that either erase or distort their realities, will draw upon her work on Black lesbian communities to highlight 4 points of departure in the experiences of Black gay women relative to representations of white lesbian-headed families. And finally, interrogating yet another strategy of resistance to intersectional injury, namely heightening the cost for inflicting intersectional harm, Dean Spade, founder of the Sylvia Rivera Legal Project and current Williams Fellow, will grapple with contemporary efforts to humanize trans people in the face of victimization through law and order-based responses. How to think about this intervention in the context of a progressive movement to challenge over-reliance on incarceration as the exclusive answer to social problems will be explored. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished and, I have to say, courageous panelists.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon. It's really exciting, a bit scary to be here. It's really, really exciting to be here and finally meet Professor Crenshaw. I told her that her work back in the mid to late 90s in comparative ethnic studies. Mid to late 90s, when I was in comparative ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, doing queer stuff, personally and professionally, her theories of intersectionality, intersectional disempowerment and empowerment were just crucial to get out of Berkeley. Or getting out of Berkeley. Anyways, I also want to thank my friend whom I met in pre-gay life, mid-gay life, and post-gay life maybe, Saul Saravia, the director of this program. I'm really excited to be here. Good friend Santiago, actually, in the back, Santiago Bernal, he helped with some of the material that I'm going to be discussing today. When I wasn't here, he would go into my postdoc office in anthropology and put the tapes and change them in and put them out, so I didn't miss the data that I gathered. Also, just so you know, if these walls could talk, they would be screaming, you know, you crazy queen, you thought you were not, you know, gay. This is the country. This is the space where I came out as an undergraduate activist, and Dwight McBride may be in the room or somewhere else. He's a witness to some of that evolution, I think. So it's good to be here and to be alive today to do this work. A general title for this could be translating intersectionalities, and translating literally from English to Spanish and back again, but also just translating the intersectional lives we live, and thus also the intersectional injuries we suffer, right? And I'm being specific in terms of Latinas and Latinos around immigration, just so you know also a little bit of history of this project. It was born out of relative PhD poverty is what we should call it. When you graduate, you're happy, you have a lot of bills, and you got a fabulous UC President's postdoc, but that don't pay much. So when I saw a call and email that GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, was going to, for the very first time, was commissioning someone to do work on Spanish language media and representations of LGBT people, I say I want that one. So I never really studied the media formally. I'm definitely not a lawyer. I really appreciate critical race theory, but I also needed the money. So just so you know. So I have a lot of data, and some of it will be written up in much more, I think, critical ways, but for now I want to give you a taste of that. So and what I tentatively call this is Queer Genders, Linguistic Frontiers, Intersectional Opportunities and Challenges for a Spanish-Speaking United States, and in parentheses, of America. Throughout the weekend, before Monday, February 14, 2003, Los Angeles Spanish language television station KMEX, Channel 34, Univision, having had for years the highest viewer ratings for prime time than any other station in the country in any language, advertised its own 11 o'clock late evening local news using a dazzling clip of dancing and singing on stage. The ads announced a 3-day special report by Honduran entertainment reporter Cecilia Bogran on the so-called varones en tacones, or males in heels. Despite being framed in the expected context of cross-dressing entertainment and the presumably shocking oppositional sex-gender binary of men wearing heels, the special brought out great intersectional complexity about the 3 lives of male-to-female transgender Latinas and gay-identified Latinos, all Spanish-speaking immigrants. Hormonal treatments under medical observation, the slow process of transition from one sex to the other, and the decision whether to remove their penis or not were addressed next to the experiences of loneliness as immigrants, poverty, drug and substance abuse, and the transnational daily life of many surviving through sex work in the streets of Los Angeles while their families await for news of them on the other side of the border. Yet, the positive and respectful tone of the report found challenge within Univision's own newsroom immediately after its concluding piece. And to the varones en tacones who allowed Noticias 34, Channel 34 News to come into their homes, their changing rooms, in short, their lives, declared Bogran excitedly, we thank them and hope that this report helps them be understood and accepted, unquote. Minutes after her segment had ended, and in a serious demeanor, the male newscaster, Rolando Nichols, made a clarification. Before going to the break to discuss gasoline prices, and at the end of the report, our colleague Cecilia Bogran said that the series hopefully would help you understand more these persons. That was a very individual opinion from her, from our colleague Cecilia Bogran, who was the one who worked on this special report, unquote. Following Nichols' clarifying and distancing statement that the call for understanding was only Bogran's opinion, his anchoring woman partner, Teresa Quevedo, who listened quietly to Nichols' explanation without obvious expressions, retorted back, but a very good report. Nichols simply nodded, neither in agreement or disagreement, just a silent acknowledgement of her reply. Nichols' serious demeanor during the statement and Quevedo's quick and firm reply suggested that the concluding statement by Bogran must have caused some discussion or argument at the station, perhaps among anchors, among producers and reporters, who knows. That the news took precious airtime to clarify the gay-friendly opinion from Bogran indicates the charged politics of LGBT coverage in Spanish language, especially when it is politicized on behalf of understanding and acceptance. In my study of 6 months' worth of televised local and international news from this channel, and a year's worth of the entirety of the daily Los Angeles Spanish language newspaper La Opinión, which actually has the highest circulation in Spanish in the nation, Varones en Tacones was by far the most extensive and complex portrayal of non-heteronormative sexuality and gender. But it would be overly simplistic and inaccurate to qualify LGBT coverage in Spanish language news as either an all positive or all negative. And this is a very key part, because I think part of the new work that I want to do after tenure is actually, there's really no research on the presumed attitudes or stereotypes we have Latinos of one another, or that others have about us in terms of gender and sexuality. So we can claim, Latinos are all these machistas, they're stuck with Catholicism, the women are all passive, the men are all closeted. It's not really like that. I always like to talk, for example, the love and the support that my parents gave me the moment that I came out to them. And at that moment, the stories they began to share about queer life in El Salvador way before I was born. So that's not part of that mainstream narrative we have about the community. And so just to put it out, the research basically has not been done. Coverage is deliberate or indirect, sporadic or predictable, making some genders, bodies, and sexualities more visible than others. Lesbian and bisexual women are largely missing from this news. Some reports were thorough in their sensitive treatment of queer lives, while some references reinforced homophobia. Weeks could go by when there was hardly any mention of LGBT life, while some broadcasts and newspaper editions had multiple reports or references. For sure, Spanish language news media, as Tacones, Varones en Tacones suggests, has the potential for challenging its consumers to think of Latinos and Latinas, especially its immigrant majority in LA, about intersecting forms of racial ethnic condition, gender and sexual nonconformity, and class oppression. I freaked out a little bit when I got, not the invitation to come here, I said, okay, I definitely want to do this, but that we were going to kind of take Imus on. And so I said, okay, how do I link that man to this? All right, I'll try. Latino consumption and discussions in Spanish of Don Imus's, I guess you pronounce him Imus in Spanish, Don Imus comments on April 4, 2007 about the Rutgers University's women's basketball team offer an opportunity to consider further how intersectionality may be interpreted in both Latino and non-Latino lives in Spanish. A week after Imus's statement, LA area adjunct professor and La Opinión contributor Humberto Caspa drew parallels between this event parallels between it and English language anti-documented immigrant rhetoric on the radio. Specifically, Caspa noted Costa Mesa's shock jock Martin Millard, who compared Latino and Latino Americans to invading cockroaches and termites. Arguing for what he referred to as the necessary limits of freedom of expression, Caspa translated to Spanish Imus's slur somewhat faithfully, mujerzuelas de caballo enmarañado, kind of an odd phrasing, but literally tangled-haired sluts. Lacking the visual advantage of television, his translation in a print medium of the original racialized and gender insolence in English failed to capture the racial specificity of its targets. He simply failed to state that the women were black. This single print news item offers some hope and some reservation. Caspa's attempt to draw attention to Imus's insults to shed light on what he argued were the commonplace radio broadcast attacks on undocumented immigrants was a useful exercise on how differently racialized populations and their respective historically defined struggles are related and not to one another. Caspa's lack of narrative specificity, however, suggests that much intersectionality can be lost in translation. Because Latin America inflected Latino understandings of race and ethnicity in the U.S. are overwhelmingly based on the lives and images of African Americans or blacks, there is a relative conceptual and personal discomfort, I think, when trying to describe, address, or label that population in Spanish. Negro or negra, literally the color black, is typically too strong a word, seemingly offensive for the media and Spanish-speaking public to use, generally lacking the historical and ideological knowledge about the politically oppositional formation of the term in the U.S. My Salvadoran immigrant mother, for example, kind woman that she has always tried to be, hears me use it in Spanish in my parents' home as I try to be direct in terms of questions of race and ethnicity, and normalize but also neutralize its presumable negative stigma, as in la comunidad negra, the black community. While she does not contest it or admonishes me for using it, she changes the terms when answering back to the seemingly kinder, meaning lighter in tone, moreno or morena, which literally means colored person, obviously not what the term black means. The most widely used, however, actually, and directly translated version from English we actually see and hear in the media are the expected Afroamericana, or a black woman, or the descendencia africana, of African descent. Almost 3 weeks after Imus' statement, yet another article in La Opinión attempted once again to bring closer to the ongoing targeting of undocumented Latino immigrants over the radio waves. This time, it was commentary on the other side of the country from the internationally recognized Univision co-anchor Maria Elena Salinas, whose daily half-hour news is broadcast throughout the Americas 5 days a week, including the U.S., of course. Calling for the censorship of racism and not just what she referred to as vulgarity, Salinas opened her piece by commenting on the so-called Jersey Boys, Craig Carton and Ray Rosie. These radio shock jocks introduced to the listeners the game of La Caca Gacha, a play on the Spanish La Cucaracha, or the cockroach, La Cuca Gacha. As the game went, listeners were encouraged to identify, chase, and capture undocumented immigrants, illegals, to hand over to immigration officials. Insults abound, she noted, Salinas, as a result of different political views, religious beliefs, racial identities, genders, and sexual orientation. Salinas noted in her article that African American leaders needed to be commended for protesting Imus's demeaning comments. Yet she too failed to point out, again, that the Rutgers women's basketball team members singled out by Imus were black. These are but 2 brief newspaper articles linking the Imus episode with the ongoing debate over undocumented immigrants. But it's possible they begin to suggest the challenges for a Spanish-speaking public intellectual community, most likely of Latin American birth or only one generation removed from their immigrant parents, to capture racialized and gender intersectionalities that have been shaped overwhelmingly in a black-white paradigm in the English-speaking United States. Even if the Latin American inflected inability for Spanish language news to appreciate intersectionality fully, when it comes to race and gender, its queer immigrant consumers surely live the travesties of intersectional disempowerment. This has been most obvious to me when serving as an expert witness in several asylum cases involving gay, male-to-female, transgender, and lesbian Salvadoran immigrants. Here, it is the English-speaking U.S. courtroom process that is myopically essentialist and conceptually short-sighted. Quite scary essentialist arguments about expert knowledge of systems of oppression and professional legitimacy rear their ugly heads even before we get to listen to the actual applicant's testimony. As you may know, an expert witness first has to go through her own mini-trial in front of the warring parties. This examination of authenticity and professional authority was clearest to me in a case last year in downtown Los Angeles when the prosecuting lawyer, noting the heavy presence of gender and sexuality-related publications and courses and presentations in my curriculum vitae, it's very queer, argued that I just was not qualified enough to comment as an expert on general social conditions in El Salvador. According to this argument, I just knew too much about gender and sexuality, and this disqualified me from commenting on what he understood to be larger social problems of political repression and economic instability. After passing this first litmus test with the help of the judge, the Asian American prosecuting lawyer tried to delegitimize my expertise, wanting to use my own testimony against me. If given the grim and dangerous picture I drew about El Salvador's long-standing patriarchal practices, he began, in everyday life, in religion, in state bureaucracy, in cultural mores, in economic opportunities, and so on. And these conditions made it impossible for the applicant to live without fear of harassment, persecution, or even death. And yet I, the expert, still went back to El Salvador repeatedly for several years for personal and professional reasons. It must be really scary when you go back, he asked sarcastically. Probably no more than a second later, I answered, yes, it is, but the difference is that I am a U.S. citizen and I am under the protection of this nation state. My sharp-tongued retort, I believe, was critical in winning the case, as problematic and hypocritical as it was, that naturalized me, of course, activated an exaggerated patriotic differentiation between advanced America and backwards El Salvador on behalf of the applicant's hope for him to have a chance to share in this American ideal of freedom and democracy, none of which I actually believe in, right? So.
Okay, hi. First, I really want to thank the organizers, and I want to thank UCLA for inviting me here to be at this symposium. It's great to be here, and I also want to say a special hello to Russell Robinson's parents. I've known Russell for many years, and it's just really an honor to meet his parents and for them to be here. Okay, so my paper is actually slightly different than the ones that we've been looking at today because it looks at a slightly different kind of intersectionality. And it looks at the intersectionality within intellectual properties like brands and trademarks. So before I sort of talk a little bit about how intersectionality applies, let me just say a little bit about trademark law. Trademark law protects symbols, logos, and brands. So Abercrombie and Fitch would be a trademark. And it has an interesting provision within the sort of nexus of trademark law where it is one of the few content-based provisions that we have in the law today. And it requires the Trademark Office to deny registration to marks that it deems immoral, deceptive, scandalous, or disparaging. And it's interesting because most other areas of law have recognized that there are subjective problems in these kind of classifications and have sort of abandoned enforcing them. Trademark law actually winds up being one of the few areas where there is, in fact, a lot of vitality in these provisions. And so let me talk to you a little bit about two recent cases. One case, in 2003, district court overturned a ruling that canceled the trademark in the term Washington Redskins on the grounds that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate that the term was disparaging to Native Americans. And in the opinion, the judge observed, quote, "There is no evidence in the record that addresses whether the use of the term redskin in the context of a football team would be viewed by a substantial composite of Native Americans in the relevant time frame as disparaging." And the court reaches these findings despite the observations of one scholar who observed that the term redskins is, quote, "the absolute, unquestionably worst term. There is no context for which the term redskins is not offensive." Now, just a few years later, however, the Trademark Office took a different view and denied federal registration to a group that sought to trademark the term dykes on bikes to mark the annual contingent that has historically led San Francisco's Gay Pride Parade. Now, in that case, the Patent and Trademark Office on 2 separate occasions had rejected their application on the grounds that the term dyke was a vulgar, offensive, and scandalous term, even though the participants themselves sought to label themselves with the term. So commenting on the office's decision, a prominent archivist, Joan Nessel, observed, I cannot imagine a more ironic twist of thinking than to judge this reclaimed badge of honor as insulting to the very community that has created its power. Both of these cases were eventually permitted to go forward. The Redskins case was reversed on other grounds, and the PTO decision in the Dykes case was also reversed as well. Yet both cases raise a point about the potential conflict between the fluidity of language and the stabilizing force of property rights, demonstrating that intellectual property's incomplete framework offers us little to address the complexities between culture, property, and speech. Why is it that one party is permitted to propertize terms like Redskins that are outstandingly pejorative from the perspective of a targeted group? But when the targeted group, Dykes on Bikes, seeks to propertize a disparaging term, precisely to excise it of its disparaging impact, they are barred from doing so. So what the paper does is try to kind of discuss both lines of cases under a theory that I call trademark intersectionality. And let me begin just by saying a little bit about intersectionality as a general theory, which is a theory about discrimination that really stemmed from the work of our fearless moderator, Kimberly Crenshaw. And what she argued was that the experiences of black women could not be adequately summed up by a simple reference to gender discrimination, right? But they were both part and parcel of their unique experiences that focused on both race and gender. And part of the process of grappling with intersectionality is that it forces us to really face the power of the narrative, right? That in order to really understand the experiences of folks who are discriminated against along the lines of more than one identity, we have to develop a fuller understanding of how intersectional categories produce a unique and different narrative. So, the question is, how do we apply this theory to property, or more specifically to intellectual property? And here we are dealing with a couple significant differences. The biggest one is that we're dealing with intangible things rather than tangible persons. But is that really the case? Consider the example of Aunt Jemima. Aunt Jemima, I would argue, cements a growing trend in American advertising, right? The use of ethnic minorities, particularly African and Native Americans, that relies on stereotypical representations in order to sell products. So let's talk a little bit about how Aunt Jemima was born. In 1889, the owner of the Pearl Milling Company, Chris Rutt, happened to attend an evening performance of a team of blackface minstrel comedians who were known at the time as Baker and Farrell. And at the time, they were performing one of the most popular songs of the day, a song titled Old Aunt Jemima. Clad in aprons and red bandanas to conjure up the image of a black female Southern cook, and using a rollicking tone and rhythm, the performance enraptured white audiences across the country. And immediately, sitting in the audience, Rutt realized that he had found the perfect hook for the pancake mix that he had just invented. Mesmerized, Rutt knew that the song and costume projected the image for which he had been searching. He decided to mimic it, using not only the name, but the likeness of the Southern Mammy, emblazoned on the lithographed posters advertising the act of Baker and Farrell, thus beginning a new era in advertising. This would be the first time a living person would be used to personify a company's trademark. And at the time, few probably and those are the words of Marilyn Kern Foxworth, just so you know, who's written on this. At the time, few probably realized that the birth of Aunt Jemima as a trademark would herald a new era in advertising. But it marked a curious intersection between the commodification of racial minorities and the representation of intellectual properties within the marketplace of goods. one might argue that the creation of Aunt Jemima both capitalized upon and facilitated a perceived absence in the American purchasing public, where racial minorities were cast not as consumers or even as citizens themselves to be marketed to, but were cast instead as a set of images and tools in the construction of a company brand. And so ethnic trademarks, therefore, forced a sort of perceptual segregation, to use a phrase borrowed from Russell Robinson, between the marketplace of goods and the marketplace of ideas. And in many ways, cases like Aunt Jemima point to a subtle paradox of perception that operates through intellectual property and its relationship to cultural products. That although cultures are shifting, dynamic, and fluid, intellectual property is usually considered to be just the opposite, fixed, static, and concrete. And commodification stabilizes the meaning of a mark, but it still has powerful expressive implications. And so what we need, I argue, is a new theory that recognizes the interaction of trademark law's commercial functions with its expressive connotations. Now, in the last few years, we've actually seen a number of recent cases come through the courts that have a tremendous impact on ethnic icons and brands, particularly Native American icons and brands. So for a moment, just reflect on how often we hear these brands: Cherokee, Apache, Oneida, Winnebago, Squaw Valley, Crazy Horse, and how the marketplace helps us forget that these brands also refer to actual tribes, actual people, and also painful racial slurs. Not to mention, of course, products like sports utility vehicles, malt liquor, vacation sites, military gear, eyeglasses, or margarine. And some of them are even more painful, right? Look at these three examples. Now, I argue that I think we need to grapple with the creation of a new kind of intersectionality, an intersectionality that recognizes the painful impact of marks like this and the commercial impact that they have in the marketplace. And so what I basically sort of want to argue for is an intersectionality that recognizes the intersection of a trademark's economic, constitutional, and its cultural identities. And so I sort of, in my mind, I kind of imagine three different kinds of intersectionality. One that focuses on economic intersectionality, another that focuses on constitutional intersectionality, and I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A, and also cultural intersectionality, which talks about the relationship between a mark's political connotations and its commercial ones as well. And as I've suggested, this theory of trademark intersectionality, I think, captures the overlapping and intersecting political and commercial identities of a symbol. That the matrices of identity are not just about race, ethnicity, or citizenship, but they're also about how race and ethnicity play a role in the construction of images that have both political and commercial implications. And this dichotomy, I think, does have very powerful legal implications for First Amendment jurisprudence, right? Is a trademark appropriately categorized as low-value speech because it is commercial, or do we think of it as low-value speech because of its cultural implications, particularly for the disparaging marks that I mentioned earlier? And another type of intersectionality that these trademarks also demonstrate is that of group rights versus individual rights. The tension between a company that seeks to propertize a disparaging mark and between a group that seeks to change or alter the mark's meaning in the marketplace. So now I'd like to turn to the normative implications of what I've just described. And so in the end, I argue normatively that it does actually make sense for the law to use this doctrinal device of cancellation in the trademark context as a remedy when it comes to disparaging marks like Redskins. Because what cancellation actually allows is it doesn't actually prohibit the owner of the mark from using the mark in the marketplace. It simply decommodifies the mark so that everyone can use the mark in the marketplace. And what I think cancellation allows for is it allows others to disobey and to criticize the meaning of a mark according to the company that claims to own it. And I've written a little bit about this in the context of what I call semiotic disobedience, right? The use of marks by individuals who have been targeted by these marks to excise their painful impact. A humanities professor, Scott Lyons, has defined a similar concept in the Native Studies area, and he calls it rhetorical sovereignty. And he defines this as the, quote, inherent right and ability of peoples to determine their own communicative needs and desires in this pursuit, to decide for themselves the goals, modes, and styles and languages of public discourse. And so I would extend this concept to remaking icons and trademarks for this purpose. And rhetorical sovereignty, I would argue, is certainly present in the Dykes on Bikes case, where individuals reverse the power of a symbolic slur simply by excising it of its harmful impact. And the same thing happened in the queer community with the upside-down triangle sign, which was reclaimed as a symbol of queer unity. So I think that we have to enable trademark law to allow for rhetorical sovereignty, and our current legal standards offer little room for a recognition of how truly fluid language can be. And this point is really about allowing reference groups access to the sign or the icon so that the meaning of that icon can be challenged from the perspective of the targeted group. And so last but not least, I just want to show you some examples of what this sort of semiotic disobedience that I'm talking about would produce. So this is the name of an artist, Jason Lujan, who produced a series of projects that he calls Indian Interpolations. And what he basically did was he descrambled a DVD video game in which he noticed that the Native Americans in the video game consistently lost. And he reprogrammed it to make sure that they won in every game and then put it back online. And so that's one of his projects. But the other project that he does is he takes DVDs from rental stores and jams them so that he inserts the image of the Cleveland Chief Wahoo mark. And this is actually an image from a movie called Ghost Dog. And so you would be watching the movie and you would see an image, a stereotypical image of a Native American person, and superimposed on top of it would be this mascot, right? Now, it's important to realize that cancellation allows these kinds of things to happen, right? But propertizing trademarks does not. And last but not least, this is another artist named Ryan Redcorn who has a T-shirt company, and you see that he's used the image of the Chief Wahoo mark by the Cleveland Indians entirely for the purpose of criticizing Indian mascots. And so these are the kinds of things that a semiotic disobedience or a semiotic democracy would produce. And so last but not least, I want to just point out, I started with Aunt Jemima, and I want to end with Aunt Jemima. And so I want to just show you a painting that's called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. It's by an artist named Betty Saar, and this is the painting that she has created. And I just want to sort of, while you look at this, I just want to read you a small part from Malcolm X, who talked about Aunt Jemima and used Aunt Jemima to demonstrate how white-owned businesses made millions from negative portrayals of African Americans. And he writes, instead of so much effort to escape being black, so much trying to be like the white man, the black man might have the sense to wake up from his sleep and put to use for himself the image that the white man won't let him escape. And tens of years after Aunt Jemima was created, and only a few years after X has passed, it bears noting that a few artists have come along to challenge her stereotypical image. So if we look at this painting, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, from the artist Betty Saar, in the painting, the artist challenges the smiling brand of Aunt Jemima by replacing her trademark broad smile with a more militant image. She is shown holding a broom in one hand and a rifle in another. And one commentator looking at this painting writes, "It appears that she is not smiling because she is happy, but at the prospect of one day gaining her freedom." So thank you.
So, hi, I'm Marianne Case, and as I was saying to Kim Crenshaw earlier, if the overall theme of this conference is Abercrombie, Imus, and beyond, I'm here representing beyond. The title of my talk is, "You're telling me it's wrong to do to the prisoners what the Army does to its own soldiers? Gender performance requirements of the U.S. military in the war on Islamic terrorism." And what I'm going to be looking at is that among the many disturbing reports emerging from a variety of venues at which the U.S. military has conducted interrogations of Islamic male detainees since September 2001 are those detailing exploitation of sexual and gender stereotypes and taboos as a central part of efforts to humiliate and degrade detainees. It appears from reports that female U.S. military personnel are often deliberately used in this process. The American military women in the Abu Ghraib photographs, especially Lindy England, leading a naked Iraqi male detainee on a leash, are the most well-known examples, but there are others, particularly in the interrogation process, less photogenic but perhaps equally damaging. Army linguist Kyla Williams, for example, reports being told to say sexually humiliating things in Arabic to naked male prisoners. Other female military personnel at Guantanamo and perhaps also in Afghanistan and Iraq were allegedly encouraged to degrade Muslim prisoners through forced cross-sex contact, through exposure of their own, that is to say the female interrogators' naked bodies or the naked bodies of the detainees, or through touching of prisoners with items apparently soaked in menstrual blood. There have also clearly been attempts made to feminize the detainees themselves. For example, by keeping them naked, by forcing them to a sexualized performance and positions, through threats of rape, simulated and actual rape with objects and perhaps with penises, through use of women's underwear, including pink women's underwear placed on detainees' heads at Abu Ghraib, and bras and other items of women's underwear being placed in their normal position on male detainees' bodies at Guantanamo. What I'm going to do is to consider ways in which these practices do gender-based harm, not only to the men who are their alleged targets, but to the military women involved, voluntary or not, in carrying them out, as well as to women generally. And I'm using the term gender here to describe characteristics coded masculine or feminine, sometimes irrespective of and sometimes inflected by the sex, that is, the maleness or femaleness of the person displaying the characteristics. The reason that I am here at this conference is because Russell, who has heard a version of this paper, said that among the intersectionalities the critical race program wanted to consider more was intersectionalities involving Muslims and Arabs. But as you'll see from the paper, I am going to actually downplay the othering aspect of this treatment of the detainees and suggest that it's less about certainly about intersectionality, but less about intersectionality than you might think, much more about the self than about the other. First, a few words of background and disclaimer. I haven't done any original research on this. I'm relying entirely on what's appeared in published sources that are sketchy and incomplete, and that also suffer from a sort of echo chamber effect, in that one instance gets repeated through a variety of sources without it being made clear whether this instance is unique or representative. And most of these sources are reporting second or third hand, including reports produced by the various military commissions, by journalists, by expert witnesses, by lawyers, both for military perpetrators of alleged abuses and by detainees. I've consulted as many first-person reports by military participants as I could, including autobiographies by Janice Karpinski, the commanding general at Abu Ghraib, by female soldier Kyla Williams, autobiography called I Love My Rifle More Than You, and ask me about where that title comes from if you don't know. By Chaplain Yi, the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo who was investigated for treason and ultimately accused of adultery and downloading pornography. By 3 male interrogators, one each from Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And I've also read available first-person accounts by detainees. And in the end, my analysis came to be structured around 3 direct quotations from first-person accounts, 2 by interrogators and the third by a detainee. The first of the quotes forms part of the title of my talk. I should say that neither torture nor violent conflict nor the Arab and Muslim world are in my areas of expertise. I have, however, had long experience in the research of gendered norms, including norms of masculinity, for example, as an observer of the integration of women at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, a state-sponsored military academy, whose purpose is not to train professional soldiers, but to train citizens using military techniques. These experiences came to seem much more relevant than I would have predicted in advance. I thought that I would be focusing more than in the end I will on 2 things, both of which have to do with the othering of the detainees and a view of them as inferior and different. The first is that some similar practices have reported in state prisons in the United States, including the use of pink women's underwear to punish prisoners, for example. And among the many reasons to find prison practices particularly relevant was that it was reported that ringleaders among the soldiers at Abu Ghraib had prison guard experience. also thought that I would view as far more determinative and central than I now do the stereotyping of Muslims. Much of the reporting done suggested that books such as one called The Arab Mind, written by cultural anthropologist Raphael Bataille in 1976, and prominent on the shelves and reading lists of the U.S. military, had led to assumptions concerning how Muslims, Muslim men in particular, would react to contact with women, to impugning of their sexual honor, to disgrace associated with nudity and challenges to masculinity. I'm not suggesting at all that these models on how to treat the other were not relevant, and I'm happy to talk about them in more detail in questions and answers. But I came gradually and somewhat reluctantly to the conclusion that, in a sense, conservative commentators in the U.S., such as Rush Limbaugh, were right when adopting a line from the Schlesinger report that what happened at Abu Ghraib was, quote, Animal House on the night shift, unquote. They had an underappreciated point when they repeatedly said of what was reported to be happening that this is the sort of thing that happens in fraternity hazing, that it happens regularly in male-on-male contexts in the United States. In other words, it's not simply about treating the prisoners as the other, it's doing to them what was done to us. And let me be clear, if there's any doubt, my agreement with Limbaugh is descriptive and not normative. The descriptive fact that practices were common to frat hazing and to detainee treatment causes Limbaugh to think that the treatment of detainees was nothing to worry about, but it confirms in me the conviction that we should worry more than we do about hazing. Something that runs through my analysis is that practice after practice, especially the practices males imposed on other males, were the sort I was familiar with from my study of VMI that go on in frat hazing, boot camp, and military academies and the military in the U.S. to this day. If you look at, for example, the complete list of findings of abuse from the Taguba report, including punching and slapping, photographing people naked, forcing them in sexually explicit positions, to remove their clothing, to wear women's underwear, to masturbate themselves, to put them in a pile and jumping on them, I could go on. Every single one of these practices, the sexualized ones, every single one, the non-sexualized, almost all, the exception being threatening with pistols, is something that scholars of hazing have documented in, for example, both white and black fraternities throughout the United States. Now, part of the reason why, part of the reason why this is happening, and again, let me sum up my analysis here again with my title. Using the words of the military interrogators, you're telling me it's wrong to do to the prisoners what the Army does to its own soldiers. Part of that was a deliberate self-justificatory effort, right? If they're trying to show that the practices are legal, they say, well, they have to be legal if the Army can make us do them. But it also goes beyond this and shows what scholars of torture have suggested is the improvisational nature and the limits of imagination on the part of torturers. Now, part of what I'm talking about is not gendered practices. For example, the soldier I was quoting was protesting his reprimand for using stress positions. He said, these are the stress positions I was asked to assume for the length of time I was asked to assume them. It also applies to forms of labor as punishment. For example, there's been a lot of press given to report claims by a female Muslim detainee in Iraq that she was forced to burn large buckets of excrement, that this made her ill and also made her feel degraded. Burning of excrement is, in the first place, a necessary task for the Army in the field, and secondly, one that is described as being assigned in the way that, for example, KP was to people in the Army in World War II, as a routine low-level punishment for members of the military themselves. It's also true, interestingly, of quite a lot of the sexualized violence. Compare, for example, recent accounts by Muslim detainees with Anthony Swaffer's Jarhead, where he describes practices such as field fucking, which is simulated sodomy perpetrated on someone who's getting above himself, which in Jarhead is done by members of the company, to members of the company, again, in the presence of press photographers and in a way that's photographed. Specialist Darby, who works at Abu Ghraib, explains to reporter Anderson Cooper why I initially laughed when he saw a screensaver photo of a pyramid of naked men. He says, I didn't realize it was Iraqis, because we lived in prison cells too. I laughed, and then I realized it was prisoners, and then he realized they were forced to do it. Now, even Charles Grainer, one of the ringleaders of the sexualized abuse, reportedly poured fluorescent fluid from a broken light bulb on his own penis as well as on those of detainees, exhibited himself as well as detainees nude and glowing, photographed himself as well as the detainees in sexually explicit positions. Thus, Susan Sontag is right, I think, when she says it's surely revealing as more Abu Ghraib photographs enter the public view that torture photographs are interleaved with pornographic images of American soldiers having sex with one another. I want to argue that it's not just revealing of the pornographic imagination, however, it also reveals that treating the other like the self doesn't always always translate into treating the other well. Rather than needing to imagine or learn from anthropologists of the Arab mind how sexualized abuse might make detainees feel, soldiers could recollect how it made them feel. This use of feminization is something that's, as a means of degrading military, is staggeringly common throughout the military. This brings me to the second of the three quotations around which I'm organizing my analysis. One of the detainees said of his treatment, quote, "They wanted us to feel as though we were women, the way women feel, and this is the worst insult, to feel like a woman." Now, this is the sort of thing I saw at VMI all the time. Christine Littleton, who was commenting on the objection made by opponents of integration that if you introduce women, then you eliminate these successful degradation techniques, said, pity the poor drill instructor who screams, "What are you, a woman?" at a female rat. I should tell you that the officially approved term of degradation at VMI is now maggots, because it's not gendered, which of course is one letter off from faggots, which certainly is gendered. And when I first delivered this paper at a conference in Amsterdam, and there were military from all the world, and I said, how universal is it a practice to denigrate people by comparing them to women? I was told that when I asked this, the Dutch military all said to themselves in the hearing of one of the American observers, "Oh, no, we do not denigrate people by comparing them to women. We denigrate them by comparing them to homosexuals." Since I'm running out of time, I want to talk about, in addition to how abuse techniques are sexed, how they are gendered. What both communist bloc interrogation techniques, which Sears, from which we get a lot of U.S. models, comes from, and the hazing practices have in common is that they have the purpose and effect of breaking down the person subjected to them. This is seen to be useful in producing the abject submission that is a common goal of both Cold War communist interrogation and military unit cohesion, and for both a prelude to rebuilding a new man along new lines. But breaking down detainees is not or should not be the goal of interrogation in the War on Terror. Unlike prisoners of the North Koreans, Stalin, or the Viet Cong, persons detained by the U.S. in the War on Terror serve no useful purpose when they make a false confession. What we should want from them is forced, reliable information and not submission. And those who have made the most detailed and systematic studies of the effectiveness of interrogation techniques seem to be in basic agreement that it is not the harshest techniques, but the gentler ones that have the best track record of producing reliable information. Harsh techniques may be more tempting, but the gentler techniques like fear down and ego up, which are terms of art, have been shown to be much more effective. Nevertheless, harsh techniques are in favor, both among policymakers, among those handling techniques, and generally over time among interrogators, including female interrogators. So let me give you the best explanation why in the third of the three quotations around which I've organized my analysis. Quote, "They'll think we're fucking pussies. We can't let them fuck us every time." This is the flip side of feminization. Just as it is important to make the detainees feel like women, it is the worst thing in the world to feel or look like a woman yourself. On this, the Arab Muslim detainees and the American soldiers can agree. The flip side of the problematic, the need to be perceived as masculine, even at the cost of being effective, is one I'm familiar with my study of gender in the United States, and I draw to your attention something you're going to know about in a way that most people won't, which is the Christopher Commission, whose mission was not to examine sex and gender, but to examine police brutality in the aftermath of Rodney King. They came back with a series of reports and recommendations that said, we've constructed the role of police officer in a thoroughly masculine way. We seek to hire people who are aggressive. What we should want is communicators. We seek them from the armed forces. We should seek them from among social workers. So we've gendered policing masculine. We should be gendering it feminine. Not necessarily hire more women the way the LA City Council responded, but to evaluate effective techniques without confusing masculinity with effectiveness. But the lessons of the Christopher Commission have been lost in the War on Terror, not only abroad in the military context, but at home, as Susan Paluti reports. Their law enforcement agencies are increasingly shifting funds from community policing, where female police officers distinguish themselves, to all-male counter-terrorist squads. Now, and the favored interrogation technique is not fear down or ego up, but a new technique called fear up harsh, with harsh being the operative word. This leads me to the most disturbing of the interrogation techniques, developed apparently to exploit what were thought to be Muslim stereotypes, Term of art for it is invasion of space by female. This is the technique that the female interrogators who more explicitly sexualize their informants engaged in. What disturbs me is that this actually reinforces rather than undercuts what I understand to be Muslim stereotypes of women and of the West. That is to say, women are already in Islam associated with fitna, with disorder, and Western women in particular are thought to behave like wanton prostitutes. Even if the military is going to focus on exploiting Muslim stereotypes, whether true or false, invasion of space by female is a bizarre way to engage with those stereotypes, reinforcing rather than undercutting or disturbing detainees' views of women and of the West. So I want to leave you very briefly with a dramatic contrast. Previously done work on another gender performance requirement of the U.S. military, some ways very different, other ways eerily similar, case of Lieutenant Martha McSally, who when she was a U.S. Air Force fighter pilot stationed in Saudi Arabia at around the turn of the millennium, brought a constitutional lawsuit against the U.S. military because it required her while off base in Saudi Arabia to veil fully in an abaya, which is the all-encompassing Saudi version of hijab, and to be accompanied at all times by a male whom she was instructed to say falsely was her husband. Not a requirement of the Saudi government, not a requirement of non-military U.S. female personnel, such as State Department women. McSally ultimately got the U.S. Congress by voice vote to overturn the policy, largely out of sympathy for her as a poor Christian woman forced to present herself in Muslim dress. Very little attention or vocal sympathy was given by members of Congress to her equally heartfelt, equally strong claim that the U.S. military's requirements of her violated her U.S. constitutional right to equal protection on grounds of sex, because it not only treated her differently, but did it in a way that undermined her command authority. I think the contrast, which is in some ways not so great a contrast, between respecting and accommodating Muslim sensibilities concerning the proper behavior of women in the one case, and deliberately exploiting and violating those sensibilities in the other, adds up to a systematic subordination of women by the U.S. military, as well as to reinforcement rather than an undercutting of stereotypical Muslim assumptions about women and their place. Thanks.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm here this afternoon to share some of the research I've conducted on Black and Latina women who are gay and creating families. A close study of existing research on lesbian populations reveals a tendency for scholars to generalize experiences of lesbian practice and the enactment of gay sexuality based on the histories, cultures, and political ideologies of white, middle-class, feminist women. However, alternative histories for women in other race and socioeconomic groups offer new dimensions of the relationship between gender and homosexuality, but these remain underanalyzed and under-researched. And as a result, whiteness in lesbian sexuality tends to be privileged, and gay women of color continue to remain invisible in the academy, in LGBT political organizations, in their own racial and ethnic communities, and in larger mainstream society. My research covers 3 years in the lives of these women. It gives voice to the simultaneity of blackness and lesbian sexuality and contributes new knowledge to show how past identification statuses based on one constructed category, in this case race, influence how individuals perceive and enact an additional group membership based on sexuality. Now it does this through the analysis of a group of women who, because of year of birth, geographic location, social class, and other characteristics, came of age during periods of heavy segregation and entered into their gay sexualities with firmly entrenched black identities and a strong race consciousness. I argue that initial self-understandings based on race influence subsequent practice of same-sex desire, processes of union formation, routes to motherhood, and the enactment of gendered power relations in families headed by 2 women. Now, data from the 2000 census suggests that black same-sex couples are significantly different from white gay couples on several demographic measures. They have less education, They are less likely to be employed full-time. They have a lower median annual income. They have lower rates of home ownership. And they're more likely to have children living with them in the home. And on many of these measures, black same-sex couples actually look quite similar to African American heterosexual couples. Now, in 2005, I completed about 30 months of data collection on black American, West Indian, and Latina women who are gay in New York City. I gathered a variety of data, 30 months of participant observation field notes. I had a survey of 100 women of color. I had 56 in-depth interviews with survey participants, and partners were interviewed separately. And I also did 4 focus group interviews. So the women who were in the study had to be creating families either through relationships with other women or through motherhood as lesbian, gay, bisexual, in the life, or women-loving women. And I'm working on a book manuscript from this study that's going to be titled Invisible Families, Gay Relationships and Motherhood Among Black and Latino Women. So the work that I'm presenting today identifies 4 points of departure black women make from existing scholarly research and media portraits of lesbian sexuality. And I suggest how a greater understanding of these experiences challenges or improves upon existing assumptions about the enactment of lesbian sexuality. So my first point is this. African Americans are likely to have developed their same-sex desire within black social and residential environments and outside of the ideologies of lesbian feminism. They more purposefully consider racial identity and racial group membership in their creation of a lesbian sexuality. Now, in the survey, more than 90% of respondents were raised in and currently reside in predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods. And in a paper that that was recently published in the journal Science, I show that during the 1970s women's movement, black lesbians were less likely to incorporate lesbian feminism into their same-sex practice. And this was due to several factors, including residential and social segregation, as well as different ideological beliefs about the best pathway to women's liberation. White middle-class women largely came to understand a lesbian sexuality in the context of consciousness-raising meetings or women's studies classes on college campuses. But black lesbians were primarily entering the gay social world through events that were taking place in other environments. Meeting minutes from black feminist organizations suggest that even many college-educated black women first came into their gay sexualities in predominantly black social or political circles. And I argue that the experience of having a formed racial identity prior to enacting a gay sexuality may affect the way same-sex relationships are practiced. And this brings me to my second point. I found that black women more consistently use gendered physical presentations of self as an organizing principle in their relationships. They accentuate rather than de-emphasize expressions of masculinity and femininity. There's also a greater range in physical representations of gender among black lesbians than has been reported in studies of middle-class white lesbian communities. But most contemporary research on gay family life has not critically examined these differences nor their implications for expectations in relationships. Now, in the 1970s, lesbian feminists took a stance that was disparaging of feminine and masculine gender display, and they encouraged women to move towards androgynous gender presentations. But many black women were never fully part of this lesbian feminist leadership or on board with all of its goals. So they were less influenced by efforts to replace butch and femme identities with androgynous presentations of self. And evidence of this division can still be seen today. So in my study, I employed 3 different methods for measuring gender presentation, because in case you haven't noticed, it's a pretty touchy topic. In-depth interviews, participant observation, and the following scale that respondents completed and returned in their surveys. And so it says, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a person whose physical appearance, including clothing, hair, style of dress, way of walking, or way of talking, are quote-unquote very feminine and consistent with those stereotypically assigned to women, and 10 being a person whose clothing, hair, style of dress, way of walking etc., are very masculine or most like those stereotypically assigned to men. Which number best represents your own physical appearance? And this is what the scale looked like. Okay. So 3 representations of gender emerged from these data, and I define them as femme, gender blender, and transgressive. About half of the sample, 48%, gave themselves a score of between 1 and 3 on the scale. When they go out, they wear dresses or skirts, form-fitting tops, purses, high-heeled shoes, all items that display a sense of femininity. And these women consistently partner with women who are less feminine than themselves. 34% of women have a style that I define as gender blender, 4 to about a 7 on the scale. Now, rather than a de-emphasis on femininity or masculinity, gender blenders combine specific aspects of both to create a unique look. They may wear men's pants or shoes, but combine them with something less masculine, like a form-fitting t-shirt or a little makeup. Upper middle class women may consistently choose tailored or loose-fitting clothing that's not very revealing to de-emphasize or downplay femininity. And 18% of women I define as transgressive. They gave themselves a score of about 8 to 10 on the scale. They're similar to what past research has labeled stud or in a previous generation of black women, or butch in predominantly white women's community. They use the female body as a site for signifying masculinity. So I thought I'd give you some photographs of some of the couples in the study to see, so that you could see what I'm talking about here. So first we have Naja Rhodes and Dr. Renee Martin and their 2 dogs, Lady and Di. And Lady and Di are the real names, and the pseudonyms are Naja and Dr. Martin. And so Naja's a femme social worker, and Dr. Martin has on those lovely men's Abercrombie army fatigue shorts that we've been talking a lot about. They own a house in Brooklyn. And they were married in Tulum, Mexico this past May. This is Tara Evans. She's an associate for a major hotel chain, and her transgressive partner, Pam Johnson, who owns a Burger King franchise in New Jersey. And Pam thinks she's cool. And then finally, this is Jocelyn Barnum, a consultant for the Board of Ed in the city of New York. And she's feminine, and her partner might be considered transgressive. Joy gave herself a kind of 7 or 8 on the scale. And in their wedding commitment ceremony, Joy was referred to as the groomette on the program. So I found that the social norms in black lesbian environments encourage women to use these physical presentations of gender as an organizing mechanism for their intimate relationships. And this finding is contrary to research on predominantly white populations that say today's lesbians de-emphasize feminine and masculine representations of gender or do not exhibit them in any consistent way. And here I'm thinking of work by Lillian Faderman and also by Kath Weston. Now, regardless of racial or ethnic background, most middle and upper income lesbians are reluctant to assign themselves to a category, or they do not want to analyze the meanings of these categories for the lesbian community. And one reason for their reluctance is a fear that a more feminine or more masculine physical appearance will be interpreted as an effort to recreate patriarchal relationships. But I argue that this interpretation is faulty, and I find that differences in the way individuals physically show their gender do not always follow the patterns of power and subordination that we've come to understand in male-female relationships. Women who are the more feminine looking often possess the greater power in the relationship. And so my work shows that from the 1960s onward, black women have been less likely than white women to interpret the expression of a gendered self as a primary component of their oppression as women. And in the risk of time, I want to say this again. They've been less likely than white women to interpret the expression of a gendered self as a primary component of their oppression as women. For example, they do not find that portraying a feminine gender presentation threatens their credibility as a strong woman. And consequently, they've been less likely to require the elimination of a gendered self as a dominant pathway to their own liberation. And this stands in contrast to feminist arguments that call for the suppression of gender difference as a strategy toward achieving gender equality. Now, a third finding from this work is that black women draw from historical understandings of the heterosexual family as a location of women's economic empowerment rather than primarily as a site of patriarchal oppression. And as a result, they measure egalitarianism not by the equal distribution of household labor, but by each person's financial independence and economic contribution to the home. Now, about 90% of the women in my survey are employed or in school full-time, and 80% disagree or strongly disagree with the statement, quote, "It is better if one person in the relationship takes the major financial responsibility and the other person takes the major responsibility of caring for the home." Well, the in-depth interviews suggest that partners value self-sufficiency and autonomy for themselves and for their mates. For example, Shelley Jackson is a 38-year-old bus driver. She lives with her 3 kids in a high-rise housing project in East New York. Her partner, Shantae Austin, moved in with the family 2 years ago. When asked how happy she is with the way they divide household responsibilities, Shelley comments that she's happier in the relationship now that her partner has found a job. She says, "Don't get me wrong, she has always been so good to me as far as helping me out with the kids, because my hours is crazy and Shantae is somebody I could depend on. But it was hard when she wasn't working. She wasn't having no income coming in, and I was like, I'm not your sugar mama." So Shelley's comment, "I'm not your sugar mama," emphasizes her expectation of Shantae's economic contribution and also draws on negative images of women's dependence on a, quote, "male sugar daddy." She says that when Shantae was unemployed, she would have dinner ready for Shelley. She would help the children with their homework and put them to bed when Shelley worked late hours. And while Shelley acknowledged and appreciated Shantae's work around the home, it did not compensate for a lack of financial resources. Now, the expectation that partners have equal responsibility for providing economically does not mean that they also share an equal responsibility for housework. In the survey, 91% of women agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, quote, "Both mates in a relationship should divide evenly the household tasks." However, when it comes to actually carrying out the daily chores, the women do not actually behave in egalitarian ways. Now, most lesbian households with children are actually similar to stepfamilies because their children have entered the family through one partner's prior heterosexual relationship. In my forthcoming paper in the American Sociological Review, I show that the bio moms in these lesbian stepfamilies perform more of the household organizing tasks, and they assume greater responsibility for making sure various chores and activities are implemented smoothly. They accept this responsibility because they're likely to see the household and its efficiency and how it's run as a representation of themselves as good partners to their mates and as good mothers more generally. They also accept responsibility because having control over these areas also allows them to have the final say in other aspects of the family that are important to them, particularly money management and child rearing. And this authority often translates into greater power in their relationships. Last point, because I'm out of time, is that they're less likely to bear children using alternative insemination techniques. They primarily bring children into their unions through one person's prior heterosexual relationships, but they're less likely than other lesbians to have born children in the context of a marriage. They also rely more heavily on formal and informal adoption of kin, which is consistent with the larger traditions in black communities more generally. Income, ideology, and culture influence pathways to lesbian motherhood. And you can see here, this is a national survey of lesbians by Morris, Balsam, and Rothblum. And you see that black women are more likely to have children. They're less likely to have been married. They're more likely to have had children, less likely to have had children in the context of a marriage. They're more likely to have had children through adoption, and they're less likely to have children using alternative insemination. So to conclude, I want to say that this work challenges gender essentialism as defined by noted law scholar Angela Harris in the existing portrayals in literature on lesbian family life. Background and ideological factors such as race, ethnicity, family history, neighborhood environment, and gender identity and expression affect how we do sexuality and how we form families. And so previous identification statuses based not just on race, but geography, social class, or other categories influences how individuals perceive and enact later group memberships like those based in sexuality. And so it's useful to understand how lesbian practice is enacted in alternative contexts. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank Russell and Saul and all the people who put this event together. It's really been a wonderful day, and I've gotten a lot out of it, and I really am honored to be included, and my fellow panelists for bringing up such interesting topics already. When I first thought about joining this panel, I was thinking about sharing some work with you all about trans people's hypervisibility and invisibility and the ways in which that operates along a racialized framework of spectatorship and fascination, and the ways that's reflected in the law, the ways that trans people are required to show our bodies and our medical histories to administrative processes at all times, and the ways that that has racialized sort of stories underlying it, racialized impacts. But and I wanted to just sort of generally think about the uneasy relationship to the notion of visibility, and specifically media visibility, that we've sort of inherited from a white gay and lesbian framework in terms of something that David Eng brought up earlier, the sort of queer liberalism, or that Lisa Dugan and Jasbir Puar have called homonormativity, thinking about sort of the assumptions that visibility is a good thing within queer contexts or for lesbian gay people and therefore for trans people, and that the ways in which that assumption sort of rests in understandings of whiteness. And Jasbir Puar specifically has done a lot of really amazing thinking about these things and looking at the ways that homonormativity emerges in a neoliberal context where white, gay, and lesbian people are being hailed as subjects of formal legal equality in a context of sort of privacy and heteronormativity that is not available to people of color. And she specifically looks at the context of the war on terror and how this massive criminalization and militarization of immigrants is occurring at the same time as this emergent white formal legal equality framework for certain gay and lesbian subjects. So she does that work, which is amazing. And that's what I was thinking of talking about. But the recent murders of Sanisha Smith and Lawrence King have prompted me to want to talk to you all about something else, which is really related to the same set of things. Also related to the kind of racialized gender scrutiny and surveillance that trans people of color experience, and the specific targeting within immigration and criminal justice system settings. And honestly, there's absolutely nothing new about anything that I'm going to say to you. In fact, I realized I sat in this room 8 years ago and talked about what was wrong with hate crimes legislation on a Chicano Latino Law Review panel when I was a student here. So, you know, the things that I'm saying are things that have been well said by Lisa Crooms, by many people. But I think that there's nothing, I couldn't think of anything more politically urgent today to talk to you about than the ways in which gender violence is mobilized to build the criminal justice system and militaristic strategies. And we can think of so many examples of that, from the use of rape to justify systems of criminal justice, the use of the emergent dialogue about sex trafficking or human trafficking as a way to build criminal justice systems internationally, hate crimes laws, the use of the lives of Afghani women to justify the bombing of that country, etc. So I wanted to think about these murders, and especially I wanted to think about this idea that I think we come up with a lot, that when trans murder victims are portrayed in the media, that's like a good thing for trans people because it's a human face on the experience of transphobia. And I want to think about that as in the context of racialized media coverage. And you know, obviously the first point that you come up with this is that everybody says and that everybody knows is that is the value of white life over the lives of people of color. So the ways in which hate crimes against white people are, you know, covered extensively and mourned deeply. We can think of the difference between Matthew Shepard and Sakia Gunn. We can think of the difference between Brandon Tina and the unknown numbers of trans women of color who are consistently murdered and whose names never get spoken. And certainly within the context of all of this, there's a desire for a humanizing representation of trans people that's really serious. Whenever you go to a Trans Day of Remembrance celebration, you always hear people talk about all the people who've been sentenced for killing a trans person and have gotten the same sentence that you would get for killing a dog. That's the example people always give, right? And that's really happening, and that's really true. At the same time, I think that I want to think about that sort of good coverage as humanization issue in terms of the notion that we become human through the imprisonment of others, and that is the way in which our lives gain value. And that, I think, is sort of this message that's going on in this media cooptation of our deaths. To think about this, I think it's useful to go back to, I'm just doing the classics, to go back to thinking about the perpetrator perspective, which Alan Freeman, I'm just going to give a few quotes because I think it's useful. He describes the perpetrator perspective in that it sees racial discrimination not as conditions but as actions, inflicted on the victim by the perpetrator. The focus is more on what particular perpetrators have done or are doing to some victims than the overall life situation of the victim class. Misguided conduct of particular actors is the focus. It creates a class of innocents who need not feel any personal responsibility for the conditions associated with discrimination. And it's, of course, always focused on a causation requirement. So it's about those bad actors who we've talked about throughout the day who do these bad things. And in the last panel, we were talking more about employment discrimination. In this instance, we're talking about people who kill us or who kill based on sort of these inappropriate motivations. And another thing that he says about the perpetrator's perspective is that it makes results irrelevant, right? And that's one thing we can, of course, say about penalty-enhancing statutes is that there's never any evidence that punishing people longer for killing us makes them kill us less. But the results don't matter because it's about noticing the violation, right? That's his place, his point. And I think that the other piece of this that has been articulated well, mostly I think a lot in women of color feminism, is that it casts the state, this kind of penalty enhancement statutes or hate crimes statutes, cast the state as the protector in a way that declares that the general context is neutral but for individual perpetrators, right? It makes a systemic assessment of violence impossible and also creates an environment, which has also been talked about a bit today, specifically in the second event of today, in which any kind of accusation of transphobia or racism is grave and aberrant, right? It's something that is, someone called the R bomb earlier in one of our panels, right? That it's something that's so impossible to accuse anyone of because it's this sort of notion of this rarefied example. And of course, this is all based in a privatized, individualized, universal rights framework that we know to be a white framework that neutralizes the overall context and abstracts citizens from conditions, right? And so this is sort of where we get ideas like equal opportunity, right? Sort of this kind of neutral framework. And part of the underlying problem in all of this, right, is how we define violence, the ways in which violence becomes centralized around private violence and the ways in which state violence becomes erased. That continues supporting the notion that the status quo is neutral and the state as a neutral arbiter of discrimination or violence. And part of this, I think, feeds into a longer discussion we could have about the universalization of the notion of nonviolence that obscures the state's violence and is a huge part of criminalizing social movements that have named the violence of the state and acted in self-defense, right? So that's part of this move also, is to make those who identify the state's violence and see themselves at war with the state impossible to conceptualize within a framework of social change, and then possible to assassinate, for example. And so thinking about this, in terms of how these kinds of law changes build the law and order state, a project that's already well underway and wildly successful. We now have 1 in 100 people in the U.S. in prison, which is, in case you didn't know, a really big change from not that long ago. It's a very fast climb. And of course, always Cruz makes the basic point, which is so useful, that always these kinds of law changes will impact those who are already most impacted by the criminal justice system, so that laws like these will always be enforced against people of color and low-income people and other people who are targets of that system and overexposed to its scrutiny. And Puar, I think, makes this contribution of helping us think about the homonormative subject that's being constructed right now, such that we could be building an idea of formal legal equality for certain lesbians and gay men, and maybe certain trans people. It's hard to say. I think that part of the reason that this intervention is meaningful to me is because we're at a crossroads of, are we going to be invited into this same project of building this white homonormative subject? And Puar juxtaposes sort of the Lawrence privacy dynamics of that project against the simultaneous disappearances of immigrant men, the endless detention, and this notion that certain kinds of heteronormativity and family recognition are less and less available to many heterosexual people of color while becoming more available to certain white gay subjects. And that's just sort of in the same vein as this notion of who has access to the protection of the police, right? And to think about this, I think I always want to replace this definition of violence that's being utilized by the state in these contexts and being utilized by activists who are calling on the state for protection with this definition that I think I utter every time I open my mouth from Ruthie Gilmore, whose definition of racism is group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, right? So Ruthie Gilmore is helping us think about violence not in the context of individual one-on-one violence, but rather in the context of the loss of life chances for entire communities of people, for entire populations, right? And that gives us a sort of different account of racialized violence, the racialized violence of criminalization, right? And makes us think differently about what it would mean to actually save trans people's lives, right? Because if we understand trans people to be disproportionately low income, homeless, and incarcerated due to sort of cycles of racialized violence, including the racialized violence of ending welfare, or the racialized violence of building prisons, or of punishing youth as adults, or all of the other or of the three strikes law, or of so many other innovations that we see consistently enhancing the power of the military and criminal justice systems, we could shift our notion of what it might mean to sort of save lives, right, or to account for the loss of trans life that is so common. And I would argue that the loss of trans life, while being significant at the hands of murderers, which it really is more significant at the hands of sort of these kinds of broader policy changes that people call abandonment or neoliberal economic policy. So part of thinking this through requires us to understand that sexuality and gender do become central locations to mobilize police and state surveillance and the expansion of the prison industrial complex, that these battles are so thoroughly co-opted for the purpose of building, enhancing and improving and broadening a fundamentally racist criminal justice system. And so I'm thoughtful. I mean, recently in California, we've seen this whole push around gender-responsive prisons, a push by, I think, purportedly feminist social scientists to create a lot of new prison beds in California that would look more like apartments and where women could live there with their children. Maybe some of you followed this, right? Justice Now is an organization that's really come out against this. And a lot of it is about building more prisons, which California loves to do and has been doing consistently for the last several decades at an alarming rate. And so that's this interesting question where we see this certain kind of feminist discourse being articulated, right, for the specific purpose of imprisoning more women. Because, that's how it works. If you build it, they will come. So it makes me think about, sort of to return to the media aspect of this, I was just looking back at Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? And she talks about how we're inundated with images of imprisonment, and how we're so inundated that it becomes impossible to imagine anything else, right? It's literally impossible to imagine a world without prisons for most people, because prison imagery is constant. And some of the places where you do see, for example, trans people represented would be like on Law and Order as murder victims, right? That would, again, be a positive representation, where we are a source of mobilization of yet another fantasy of locking up the guilty, violent person and making our streets safe. Although oftentimes we're also the crazy murderer. That's sort of one of our roles. And we like to be sexual predators too. So I'm interested in how we can think about stopping our investment in the law and order state and in the criminal justice system, which, in my view, sort of we think of it as we need this system we need prisons in order to put away the murderers and the rapists and the transphobes. And I think that every piece of evidence that I could muster from anything I've ever experienced, read, or been part of in the community would suggest that it is the criminal justice system and the prison itself that is the rapist, the murderer, and the transphobe. And so we might reconsider how we think about approaching solutions to these problems. I think it's useful to remember the words of Asada Shakur when she says that all prisoners in capitalist societies are victims of a criminal justice system that is based on the oppression and exploitation of people of color, right? To remember, especially to think about this when we are tempted to divide the notion between sort of the good prisoners and the bad prisoners, which I think is a common set of responses that sometimes emerge in the reform context. And if we understand prisons themselves as congealment of racialized and gendered violence, maldistribution, and extermination, it shifts how we understand thinking about responding to the private violence we face in our communities, as well as the state violence. And I think that, I feel sort of happy to report that I feel that there is a consensus emerging amongst trans activists, organizers, and lawyers who are working directly with and living in communities facing this kind of liquidation and vulnerability from state violence towards prison abolition. And I think that that's a framework that's really working for us. And there was a really meaningful event this year, which was the first national event focused specifically on trans imprisonment called Transforming Justice. And at that event, which was primarily organized by and vocalized through people who've experienced imprisonment who are trans, the notion of prison abolition was a central one because there was such a strong feeling that there was no idea of rehabilitating this system in order to save us from anything, and a deep disturbance that trans people might be the new flavor of the month in terms of a set of people whose victimization can be used to mobilize that very system. So I think that that is what given the context of these two recent murders, the one that you hear a lot about and the one that you don't hear about, Sneesha Smith, who was a client of the organization I started, I think it's an important time for us to think seriously about how we're conceptualizing violence and how those conceptualizations of violence perpetuate our own victimization and also the limitedness of our ability to imagine alternative realms.
Well, I'd like to first thank all our panelists for these wonderful presentations. I was trying to think of a metaphor that captured what I think we heard, and I thought it was somewhat like jazz. Not quite the Kenny G kind of jazz, which is familiar and totally predictable, but more like Archie Shepp, challenging, provocative. At the end of the day, we kind of want to hear it all again and figure out exactly where we're moving to with this provocative set of comments. How much time, Russell, do we have? Okay, for 15 minutes. So for those of you who have some questions, please begin approaching the mic. I promised the panelists first an opportunity to either build on each other's presentations or present questions or any other kinds of comments. So why don't we take a few seconds to do that as people approach the mic.
I have one question for Mary Ann, because I had the opportunity to hear your paper before.
Nice of you to call it an opportunity. I feel terrible when you
Not at all. I'm sure I've done that too. One of the things that it made me think about was, I guess I am excited about the idea of thinking through the ways these kind of gendered punishment and hazing occur in so many different contexts, and certainly they're very relevant to the prison context and the ways in which sex segregation itself has a strategy of social control. But one of the things I'm wondering is whether your paper is making recommendations of better ways to get information out of detainees, and whether or not it is also interrogating the notion of the concept of a terrorist and the role of the military and police.
Yeah, the recommendations I have on better ways of getting information are simply my adopting and pointing out the consistency of these recommendations with everything I know about sex and gender. There are, I'm not an expert on torture, right? Or on interrogation. The people who are consistently say, and the more research they've done, the more research they've done, the more experience they have, the less they're just theorizing, consistently say, almost all of the times gentler techniques work. Again, ego up, fear down are the terms of art for them. If what you want is information, these other techniques, the ones that Sear taught, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, will produce false confessions, and there are systems for which false confessions are useful. If you want information, be nice. I call that being feminine. And not only do I call that being feminine, but clearly some of the interrogators and some of the government officials who resist these techniques think of it as being feminine, which were, to put it more crudely, think of it like being like a fucking pussy, and therefore reject it, right? Now that I have a mic, can I actually ask a question of Mignon? I may not be pronouncing your name correctly. That would be the first question. Which is, 12 years ago when I was looking at the Christopher Commission and other gendering things, I was also looking at effeminate men and transgender plaintiffs. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was, at least at that time, from the mid to the late 90s, overwhelming majority of the litigated cases involving transgressive male to female gender performance involved black men. And I theorized at the time that this might be because, and also these people, they had problems with the law, but they typically had much more acceptance from their community. And I thought this might have something to do with the fact that in the African American community, strong women are familiar, so that for a male to take on a woman's role and affect and performance is not necessarily for a male to be weak, in the same way as it is more typically, stereotypically perceived in the white world, that a man who wants to be a woman or dress like a woman or be transgressive in the direction of femininity is taking a step down. And I wondered if that were consistent with your findings.
Well, I'd have to think about that a bit, because what I've found is that there are lots of tolerances for women that are received in a very different way than when they're enacted in a biologically male body. So in terms of expectations for black women in black communities, there's a great range of what's considered feminine, right? So you can have a woman who, one of my respondents works in the manholes. She goes down in those manholes, and I don't know what she does down here, but it's very dirty work. But she, when she comes up, when she goes out, she's got long fingernails, and she's got full makeup, and she's got long straight hair. And so when she's in her overalls or her work clothes, people aren't judging her to be feminine or masculine. It's just, this is the kind of work that she does. Whereas for black men who specifically look feminine, or who I guess you could say male to female, or maybe they're just wearing women's clothes, it's a different set of issues, because first of all, they're looking very feminine. They've got, they're the ones who often are advisors for the modeling industry, right? Because they have perfected this to a science. So they are specifically enacting a very, on the one scale of femininity. Now, that doesn't mean she can't step back and curse you out, right? If you do something that she doesn't like. So, there is a greater acceptability of mannerisms that is considered apart from physical presentations of gender. So in the study, there's a second scale that asks about attributes, personality traits, and there's no relationship with looking feminine and being more demure, laid back. So there's a distinction between personality or expression or aggressiveness and physical presentations of femininity and masculinity.
Hello, how are you? This is another question for Professor Case, so sorry. I just wanted to first say thank you for a very insightful presentation. When I had first read about these torture techniques in the New York Times, I wouldn't have couched it in the theoretical framework that you did, so thank you for a very interesting and insightful paper presentation. My question is about the final point you made about the most disturbing of these interrogation techniques about space and closeness, female closeness to the male detainees. I mean, I've lived in the Muslim world, and there is no such thing as personal space. I mean, everyone's just like in your face all the time. So my question is, what assumption are you basing this on, in it being the most dangerous of these particular interrogation techniques because, like you said, it reinforces instead of undercuts some type of stereotype?
First of all, I mean dangerous from my perspective as a feminist interested in the United States' commitment to sex equality, predominantly. I mean, it's dangerous for a whole lot of other reasons, starting with its ineffectualness, right? But as I understand it, it is not part of Muslim culture for men to be subjected to physical contact with naked women not related to them. That's the kind of invasion of space that's going on. The term invasion of space by female is an American term for the practice that goes in this whole list of, I mean, who knew? I certainly didn't, that interrogation techniques have terms of art names attached to them. This is the term of art name that the soldiers and interrogators are attaching it to and putting it into a list of approved techniques that people like Rumsfeld can sign off on. And what disturbs me about it is the degradation implicitly involved in what the woman is being asked to do. And in addition to there being no reason to think that this will be effective at gaining information from the detainees, it is likely, as far as I can tell, to reconfirm, if they're already so inclined, think Muhammad Atta, right? Don't let any woman touch me even when I'm dead. And awaken in them, if they are not already so inclined, if they are, non-political Muslims that are just caught up in this accidentally, a sense of horror at the West, its sexual depravity, its corruption. What I would like is for that portion of the Muslim community that think that women should not be soldiers to rethink this. This does not seem the way to get them to rethink it, but it's going to, as I say, reinforce the, and some of the women involved in this and some of the men involved in this say, oh, this will shake them up, right? Some of them in rather nasty ways. I mean, one of the women is quoted as saying, well, in their country they get to dominate women. Now I'm in charge. I get to dominate them. And I guess what I would say to her is, even if you want to carry through that project, there are more effective ways to do it than getting naked and smearing fake menstrual blood on these men.
Okay. Ooh, tall person. Hi, I'm Carol Goldberg, one of the CRS faculty members, and this question was inspired by the trademark presentation, but I would leave it to anyone on the panel who wants to respond. And my question was inspired by some legislation that was proposed in California, didn't get through, but it was state legislation to ban Native American mascots in the schools. And this produced a response from one of the schools up on the Hoopa Valley Reservation in Northern California that was using the Warriors as their mascot, and they were concerned that this legislation would eliminate their use of this mascot. I wouldn't say what they were doing was transgressive in the way some of the artists, but they were claiming that there ought to be an exception written into this law, and actually the battle over the exception was part of what doomed the passage of the legislation. There were other forces as well. The question I want to ask is about the empirics of the consequences of using what are certainly understood by the artists as transgressive, or by the organizations like Dykes on Bikes as a transgressive use of terminology. And that is that the folks who want to use these same terms or images disparagingly will then turn around and say, well, if the group is using these terms, or if somebody is allowed to use these terms, then surely you can't disallow others from using them. And just a response. I'd be interested.
Carol, that's a really, really great point. And I mean, I think it's an issue that I actually am still really struggling with, because I think the general trend when it has come to the NCAA and other schools dealing with mascots, the general strategy has always been one of erasure, right? The idea that, you know, if you ban these marks, if you stop these marks from being used, you know, and I really fully agree with this, actually, that you wind up ending, or at least helping to end, some of the harm that has been perpetuated on Native Americans who view these marks. I guess my view partly comes from sort of thinking about how the First Amendment law sort of would govern a situation like that, an issue like that. And I have to say, I mean, you know, as sympathetic as I am to the strategy of erasure, there is, I think, represented in the artists that I talked about, this other strategy that actually allows for decommodification so that other people can actually use the mark and excise it of its painful impact. And you know, in terms of the two strategies, erasure versus reclamation, I don't know which one is more effective. I can probably think, though, that the strategy of reclamation is probably a little more safer from a First Amendment point of view than the strategy of, the strategy of reclamation is probably a little safer from a First Amendment point of view than actually banning or prohibiting these marks. The other possibility, though, which, you know, I'm more comfortable with thinking about, is the idea of simply restoring property rights in these marks for the tribes and groups to the Native American groups that originally have been using these phrases, right? I mean, certainly in the Olympic context, right, Congress passes a number of statutes and legislation that protects the use of the term Olympics to the Olympic Committee, right? And why can't it be that we can't envision Congress thinking about the need to propertize and protect these marks for Native Americans? So there are a bunch of different strategies. The goal of the paper is to kind of identify a few of them and kind of get people thinking about it. But I think that your critique and your question is right on, and I'm not sure empirically which strategy would be more successful.
Thanks, that's very illuminating.
We're about out of time, but there are two people who've been patiently waiting, so I'd like to take both the questions, and one right after the other. And those of you who are asked to respond, please do so, and if any of you have concluding comments, please take that opportunity to offer those as well.
I have both a comment and a question for Mary Ann Case. In regards to the question that Yasmin asked earlier, I think the Middle East and the Muslim world, quote unquote, I don't like to use that terminology, but it's represented as a society where men and women don't mix, and men don't like to see naked women and all that. In fact, though, brothels, prostitution, stripping, strip dancing, all the stuff that we see here and pretty much everywhere else around the world is also very present in the Middle East. I mean, it's, so the degree to which misogyny and patriarchy are present in the Middle East, it's the same here, right? Like, I don't see any difference. So that's the comment. The question is in regards to your paper, the paper you presented. You talk about the particularities of gendered violence and homophobic violence as it's deployed within the within the prison, right? Within inside the prison system at Abu Ghraib, at Guantanamo Bay, and all that, and talked about how that similar kinds of violence are deployed in fraternities and whether black or white and all that stuff. I want to throw in sort of the race question in there, and then the war question in there. How do race, right, and war change the way that violence looks and the meaning of that violence as it's deployed in prison or outside of prison when they rape women in Iraq or whatever?
This question is directed to Dr. Moore's work. So basically, I understand that there's kind of this parsing away of like gender, like what's, I guess, the white stereotype of what masculinity and femininity is. But the problem that I'm having with that is it's not as if the black community is insular and they've decided, oh, we're going to do this, and they're part of a bigger discourse. So I'm just wondering what, like, for example, are there not people who are tapping into the androgynous look and are still very much part of those black communities. So how much of it is still like, how much of them are they still tapping into like white feminist movements and then like taking that into what they're saying, and also I guess creating, even though I don't think you can really create anything, but creating like their own new definitions of gender that are still, can be read from a white standpoint, but also can be read from these black communities.
Why don't we start with Marianne and just go down the line?
Okay, first let me comment on the comment and say exactly, that's what when you say that of course there's struggles and familiarity with intersexual contact in the Muslim world, that's what I said it's part of what I meant when I said we are not upsetting Muslim views of women, even Muslim fundamentalist views of women, so much as potentially reinforcing them. I do think it's fair to say that in the Muslim world, it is not frequently that a man has a naked woman unwillingly thrust upon him. That it is the man's choice to go into the brothel. And one of my reasons for thinking this is that there are a whole series of complaints made by detainees, not just about these practices that I think we can all agree are beyond the pale, but also about any routine contact with women, female prison guards, and to some extent even routine contact with males. So there are complaints that Chaplain Yee endorses about the fact that the prisoners have no privacy for excretion, which he says, they say, he and they both say is required among Muslims and something that these men have been used to. Now, I don't honestly know how they could have been used to it in the crowded context of even ordinary prisons in Iraq, but anyway. How do race and war change these things? I know much less about how race changes them. I've been focused on how sex changes them. So what difference does it make if women are participating in these activities, women such as Lindy England? The way war changes them is to make them worse, but not nearly as much worse as I think we generally assume. So one of the things I'm resisting is something that every one of the soldiers and every one of the critics of the Limbaugh position has said, which is the difference between the soldiers and the detainees is that for the detainees it's involuntary. I think all of the scholars of hazing have suggested that leaving is not practically an option for most of the victims of hazing, and this is a fortiori true in the military context. I think it would be really clear if it were a drafted military, that everything from charges of insubordination to desertion could be brought against military victims of military hazing. So I don't want to in any way suggest that it's not much, much worse to do this to prisoners fully within your power. But I think that what we need to do is not minimize the harm to prisoners, but focus on and increase our sense of the harm to the soldiers themselves.
Just to respond to the second question, what my work is trying to do is really explain why black lesbian communities look the way they do today, and draw from historical experiences around race for women who were raised in prior generations. So the average age of the women in my study is 37 years old, and they tend to be in their 30s and 40s, a few in their 50s. If you look in today's generation, women 18 to 24, you see something a little bit different. In some ways it is still the same, but there are some differences. For one thing, you do see a greater impact of white feminism, or not white feminism, but feminism learned in traditional kind of college campuses. You tend to see more of that than you have in the past. But there is still this persistence in gender presentation. It doesn't mean that one looks like a boy and one looks like a very femmy girl. It just is trying to show that there are differences in levels of femininity, and there's a pattern to it. And so I'm trying to acknowledge that there is a pattern and to try to account for why that occurs. It's not to take away from androgynous presentations of self or people who partner with similar presentations.
Any other concluding comments from the panelists? Okay. Well, first I want to thank Horacio, Sonia, Marianne, Mignon, and Dean for really providing such insightful, provocative, new interpretations of intersectionality. My brain is just exploding right now. So I want to thank you all very, very much for a wonderful panel. And I also, of course, want to thank the CRS faculty, and in particular, thank Saul, whose work as I know a lot of times it's like herding cats, but Saul's facilitation really makes us more than the sum of our parts. And I also want to especially thank Russell Robinson, a wonderful colleague. An insightful scholar whose own work on the intersections of race and representation and race and sexuality is the scaffolding upon which this entire conference is based. So if you enjoyed the conference, which is not yet over, it is his leadership in this particular area that you have to thank for it. So thank you, Russell.